Obligations and contracts, the invisible threads that hold society together. They make promises, ordering everyone to walk the talk and protecting the rights of obligors and obligees alike. Hi, my name is Yari,
And I'm Shine.
and this is BL12 Unsolved.
Today, we're going to talk about the Article 1231 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, more specifically known as the provisions on the extinguishment of an obligation. But before we dive into that, let's begin with something simple. What does the term extinguishment mean?
That's easy, Shine. Well, in the terms of the Philippine Civil Code at least, extinguishment means the legal process by which an obligation is either terminated or fulfilled. In simpler terms, it means that whatever prestation a person owes to another, whether it be an object, money, or even a service, is no longer due. That means a creditor can no longer demand it. There are actually many ways to extinguish an obligation. That's why we need to learn Article 1231 if we want to get to know these ways. To be honest, however, I don't have much clue on what these ways are. Hindi pa kasi tinuro sa amin ni Attorney Buenafe eh. So instead, let me call on our very own legal counsel to explain these for us. Attorney Ambrosio and Attorney Mendoza. Hi, attorneys! Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. Good day, Yari and Shine. I am Attorney Nina.
And I am Attorney Laika.
And today we will be discussing 3 ways on how obligations are extinguished. These are through payment or performance,
Or by loss of the thing due.
by continuation or remission of the debt. Actually, Article 1231 states 6 ways, but today we will be focusing on the first 3 in courtesy to the next group who will be presenting. With that, let's begin.
Thank you so much, Attorney Nina. So number 1, it is the payment or performance of the obligation, which is stipulated in Article 1232 of the Philippine Civil Code. Out of all the ways to extinguish an obligation, this is seen as the most common and straightforward option, attorney. It is basically the fulfillment of the prestation as agreed upon in the obligation. It means that a debtor has paid what he or she promised to pay or has done what he had to do. Simple, right?
Alright, and with that, let us give you a hypothetical example. Let's say Beyonce and Jay-Z needed money. So on April 1, they loaned $2 million from Wally Bayola and promised that by the end of the month, they would pay him back the full amount of $2 million at Wally's house. This is called a pure obligation, meaning there is no condition, no periods, or stipulated in the contract. They just agreed that by the end of April, which would be April 30, Beyonce and Jay-Z, the debtors, would have to pay Wally Bayola, the creditor, the amount they loaned. Hence, if either one of Beyonce and Jay-Z manages to pay them the full amount of $2 million by April, then their obligation will be extinguished through payment or performance.
Very simple, attorney.
Nice explanation, Attorney Nina. But this mode of extinguishment is called payment or performance of a debt. The example you gave only shows the payment aspect of it, where Beyonce and Jay-Z paid $2 million cash. What about the performance of a debt? What does this mean? Pwede bang mag-perform na lang si Beyonce?
Well, actually, Yari, if that's a serious question, let me restate my example then. Alright, let's say Beyonce and Jay-Z really needed money. So on April 1, they loaned $2 million from Wally Bayola and agreed that by the end of the month, they will repay Wally. However, here's the catch. Beyonce and Jay-Z, instead of paying cash, offer Wally something else as payment. Instead of handing over 2 million pesos, they offer to perform at his house for a private concert on April 30. Hence, since it is stipulated in the contract that Beyonce and Jay-Z's payment be a concert, this would allow the obligation to be extinguished via performance of the debt. You see, not all payment transactions have to be actual payment of objects, according to the Civil Code. Article 1232 states that payment or performance encompasses not only the delivery of money, but also any other means of fulfilling the obligation, like an act of service.
That's right, attorney.
Wow, attorney, alam na alam mo parang hindi dinayo yung bar. Alright, let's have a recap. Payment or performance of debt is the first mode of extinguishment of an obligation stipulated in Article 1231 of the Civil Code of the Philippines. It involves key elements such as the one who pays or perform, to whom the payment or performance is made, and to where and when the payment or performance is made. Furthermore, under payment and performance, there are other special mode of payments under this. What are these, Attorney Ambrosio?
Sige, pag-usapan natin yan. So first is datation and payment, which is stipulated in the Article 1245 of the Philippine Civil Code. This is a very special mode of payment wherein the debtor pays the creditor a property instead of money to satisfy an obligation. This happens if and only if there is a mutual consent, meaning the creditor agrees to this means of payment from the debtor, allowing them to pay an asset rather than cash. For example, if Beyonce and Jay-Z, having loaned $2 million from Wally Bayola, are facing financial difficulties and cannot pay the loan back, they can pay the Lamborghini instead. It does not matter as much if the Lamborghini is worth less or more than $2 million. What matters is there is a mutual consent between the party. Wally Bayola deems it satisfactory to fulfill the obligation.
Second is the applications of payment stipulated in Article 1249 of the Philippine Civil Code. This is another special mode of payment wherein a debtor who owes multiple debts of the same kind to a creditor makes a partial payment that is not enough to cover the full amount of the prestations. Thus, the debtor has the right to designate what debt the payment will be allotted to. Let's say Beyonce has 3 loans, A, B, and C, that she owes to Wally Bayola. Each loan amounts to 1 million, totaling an amount of 3 million. Beyonce decides to give a partial payment of 500,000 to Wally Bayola and designates that payment as a subtraction on loan A. Thus, this is an application of payment since Beyonce designates her partial payment toward the specific loan she has with the creditor. In fact, in this kind of special mode of payment, the consent of the creditor is not required in order for the debtor to pick and choose which one of the prestations they wish to pay for.
Thank you so much, Attorney Nina, for that very detailed example. So let's move forward, right? So third is standard of payment or consignation, stipulated in Article 1257 of the Philippine Civil Code. This is also a special mode of payment wherein the debtor consigns the money to the court. To consign basically means to entrust or deposit. This usually happens when the debtor tries to pay the creditor the due payment. However, the creditor refuses to accept the payment without a just cause. Let's say Beyonce and Jay-Z tried to pay Wally Bayola the full amount of $2 million they owe him. However, Wally Bayola rejects the payment despite everything being as agreed upon. And there is practically no just cause for Wally Bayola to reject the payment. Hence, so that their obligation may be extinguished, Beyonce and Jay-Z consigned the $2 million to the court, which will be in safekeeping and can later be claimed by Wally Bayola when he wishes. This consignation is a legal remedy for the debtor since it allows their obligation to be extinguished with the help of a third party, particularly the court, since their payment to the court will be deemed as good as payment to the creditor, so there's that.
So wow, thank you for that, attorneys, for the very creative but stupid examples. Now that Shine and I have a better grasp of the key concepts of payment or performance, we can help you, the audience, understand it too. We shall now narrate a short case summary of Sigaan versus Villanueva, or GR number 172337. This case will help us paint a better picture and also emphasize the principles of such mode of payment. So allow us to read this case for you now. Roll VTR! These are the facts. In 1992, Ms. Alicia Villanueva loaned the principal amount of $540,000 from Sebastian Sigaan to use as capital for her business as a supplier of equipment to the Philippine Navy office. Ms. Villanueva and Mr. Sigaan agreed on obligation with a period, wherein Ms. Villanueva would make partial payments to Sebastian Sigaan. It was not a written contract, nor was there any stipulation for interest rates. However, over time, as Mr. Villanueva was paying her installments, she was being pressured by Mr. Sigaan to pay more than she needed to. In the process, she was made to pay interest despite having no stipulation in the contract whatsoever about such. Over time, her payments piled up with interest, and she had ultimately paid a total of $1.2 million, which prejudicially succeeded the original amount of $540,000. Realizing that she paid interest, which violated her right, since it was not stipulated in the contract, Villanueva demanded a refund of the excess amount to the court, leading to this case.
In conclusion, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Villanueva. It affirms that the excess payments she made were not validly due and must be returned by Sigaan. The court emphasizes that once an obligation is extinguished through a proper payment, any further payment beyond the obligation is not legally binding unless there's a clear agreement that justifies them. Hence, the ruling of the case is based on the following legal principles. 1. On the Article 1231 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, which states that an obligation is extinguished by payment or performance among other causes once the agreed sum has been paid, the debtor is relieved of further liability. In this case, Ms. Villanueva's obligation was extinguished after she had paid the principal amount of 540,000, long before her payment amounted to 1,200,000 pesos. Second, Article 1236 of the same code, which states that a debtor has the right to decide how their payment is applied, and a creditor cannot demand more than what is due without a clear agreement. Thus, what Mr. Sigaan did was prejudicial and was not based on any clear agreement he and Ms. Villanueva did. He tricked Villanueva into paying more than she was supposed to. And lastly, Article 2154, more prominently known as solutio indebiti, which states that if something is paid when there is no obligation to do so, the payer has the right to recover it. In this case, this article is crucial as it allows Ms. Villanueva to recover the money she paid unjustly to the creditor Mr. Sigaan after unknowingly paying interest.
So, all in all, this case involves the extinguishment of an obligation through payment, making it a great example for the concept of payment or performance, considering it highlights the essential legal principles regarding who can make the payment, to whom it should be made, and under what circumstances the obligation is considered fully settled. This case also touches on the issues of excessive payments and whether they can be recovered. Thus, since we already have fully analyzed the concept of payment or performance, I think we can move on to the next mode of extinguishment. Right, attorneys?
Yes naman, Yari. Now let's move on to the second way of extinguishing an obligation, which is by loss of the thing due stipulated in Article 1262 of the Civil Code of the Philippines. Out of the three modes of extinguishment, this is the one that only applies to positive real obligations to give a specific thing. Now, what exactly are the key components related to this type of extinguishment?
First, the thing is specific and determinate. Second, the thing is destroyed or lost without the fault of the debtor. And lastly, the thing is lost before the debtor incurs in delay. To clarify, allow me to give another example. On April 1, Taylor Swift and Kitty Duterte started a contract. Taylor Swift promised to give Kitty Duterte the t-shirt she wore during the 22 music video and agreed to make the delivery on April 22 as stipulated in the contract. Days pass, April 22 arrives, and Taylor Swift still has not made the delivery. Thus, by April 23rd, she attempts to deliver it via her private jet. However, a storm occurs, and it ravaged the plane, destroying everything in it along with the t-shirt. Due to a fortuitous event, Taylor Swift claimed that she was no longer liable since her obligation was extinguished because of loss of the thing due. What do you think, guys? Is Taylor Swift correct to argue this one? Or is she protected due to a fortuitous event?
So, attorney, since you explained that for an extinguishment by a loss of a thing to be valid, the thing must be specific and determinate, the thing must be lost without the debtor's fault, and the debtor must not have incurred delay before it was lost, I think in this case, although the two other elements were satisfied, Taylor Swift already incurred in delay since her plane and her shirt were destroyed on April 23, and the due date for the delivery was on April 22. Thus, this is not a valid reason to justify that obligation was extinguished by loss of a thing due, making her still liable in some way. Easy.
Excellent analysis, Yari, no? Thus, in this case, Taylor Swift is still, liable for the damages for the delivery of the determinate thing. And since the t-shirt was destroyed, she becomes liable for damages equal to the value of the shirt, and which of the value may be still decided upon by the court. Take note, one's obligation cannot be extinguished by loss of the thing due if it does not satisfy the three conditions mentioned earlier. If the loss is due to the debtor's fault, if the debtor is in delay, or if it is stipulated otherwise by the parties.
Guys, okay. Your example are great and all, but for more clarification, can you narrate an actual case again? Okay. This case is Guillermo, Austria versus Court of Appeal, Pacifico Abad and Maria G. Abad. This case involves the extinguishment of an obligation due to the loss of a thing. These are the facts. On January 30, 1961, Guillermo, Austria gave Maria G. Abad a diamond pendant worth 4,500 under a consignment agreement. A consignment agreement means that Guillermo, Austria gave Maria G. Abad the pendant merely for safekeeping. They likely planned on selling it to a third party where Abad would get commission. Maria G. Abad doesn't own the pendant. Thus, when the next thing happens, everything goes downhill. On February 1 of 1961, while on her way home in Mandaluyong, Rizal, Abad was robbed by two men. One of them struck her on the face while the other snatched her purse, which contained the pendant and cash. Austria demanded the return of the pendant or its value, but, of course, Abad failed to comply, citing the robbery as a fortuitous event that extinguished her obligation. Consequently, Austria filed a civil case before the Court of First Instance of Manila for recovery of the pendant's value plus damages. The trial court ruled in favor of Austria, holding that Abad failed to prove the robbery and was negligent for carrying valuables without security at night. Abad was ordered to pay 4,500 plus legal interest and attorney's fees. However, Abad appealed to the Court of Appeals, reversing the Court of First Instance decision. The court found that the robbery did occur and qualified as a fortuitous event, relieving Abad of liability. With that last verdict, Austria brought the case to the Supreme Court, arguing that a conviction for robbery was necessary to prove it as a fortuitous event. However, rather than reversing it, the Supreme Court affirmed the decision of the Court of Appeals. According to the Supreme Court, since Abad proved by preponderant evidence that robbery occurred and that she was not negligent, the loss of the pendant extinguished her obligation because, according to the Supreme Court, the loss of a specific and determinate thing due to a fortuitous event extinguishes the obligation to return or deliver it. Alright, ang dami kong sinasabi. Pero don't worry, patapos naman na. Thank you, Lord. Now, let's move on to the last but not the least way of extinguishment of an obligation. What is it, attorneys?
Yes naman anak, and that is continuation or remission of the debt. And out of all the modes of extinguishment of obligation, this is my personal favorite, due to its simplicity and of course the importance on legal basis. Continuation or remission of the debt is stipulated in Article 1270 of the Philippine Civil Code. And what it does is it extinguishes the obligation through the creditor's gratuitous abandonment of their right to demand payment. It basically means that the creditor has forgiven the debtor's debt and no longer intends to demand payment or performance.
So, now, Attorney Nina, thank you so much for that explanation. And also now, what are the key elements of this mode of extinguishment? First, there must be the creditor's intent, meaning creditor's intention to forgive the debt must be clear and unequivocal. And second, if the debt is already documented, then the remission must also be in writing to be valid. With this, there is also the special case of presumption of remission, stipulated in Article 1236 of the Philippine Civil Code. This is the legal presumption that a debt has already been forgiven without having been expressed as much. This happens when the debtor possesses a document of credit, like a promissory note, for example, that was voluntarily delivered by the creditor. This is important since the debtor's possession of the document of credit symbolizes that the debt has already been forgiven and therefore removes the debtor's liability. For example, Lucy Pearl plans on starting a business, but she needs funds to start it. So, she and her friend Clark decided to have a loan agreement. Lucy Pearl loans 100,000 from Will as capital for her business, and they agree that she has to pay him back after 6 months with no interest. With this, Lucy Pearl signs the promissory note providing her intent and promise to pay. However, months pass and Lucy Pearl still has not made enough money to pay off her loan. Realizing her situation, Will Clark decides to forgive the debt. But rather than saying it, he hands Lucy Pearl the promissory note, showing that he no longer intends to collect the 100,000. This is an example of an extinguishment through condonation or remission of the debt, particularly the presumption of remission of the debt. Despite Will having no express statement stating that he has forgiven Lucy Pearl's debt, his voluntary delivery of the promissory note is legally sufficient in proving that the debt is forgiven.
Ganun pala po yun. Thank you, attorney. So, to reiterate, the extinguishment through condonation or remission of the debt requires three things. The voluntary delivery of the document of credit, there must be no statement made to the contrary, and lastly, the debtor must have possession of the said document. I would give the audience an actual case to teach you more about condonation or remission, but I found out that no single ruling fits perfectly to demonstrate it. So it's more like recognized legal principle of sorts.
Yes, but one general example of condonation and remission is when a bank issued a loan to a business owner. The bank boards decide to forgive a debt due to the owner's financial hardship. If the bank delivers or formally delivers the loan agreement to the debtors with the signed statement of a waiver, then the obligation is extinguished. So there's that.
Ganon. Alam na alam mo
Aba, syempre naman, I hope you could say the same.
Eh di ikaw din lang dito mag-hosting.
Teka lang, nanonood yung mga abogado.
Sorry, attorney. So, I think it's time we can conclude today's episode. But let's give a quick recap to our audience.
Sure.
What did we talk about today? So, we first talked about what is extinguishment, and we talked in detail about what Article 1231 of the Philippine Civil Code is, which is the provisions of extinguishment of obligation. And we also discussed the ways of extinguishing an obligation. First, we talked about payment or performance. Second, the loss of a thing due. And lastly, condonation or remission of the debt. Am I missing something else, Shai?
No, I don't think so.
So I think it's time to end this episode. Once again, I am Yari,
And I am Shine.
and this is BL12 Unsolved.